Hi there, everyone. Jim here, the father of Fantasy for the Ages, the show where father and son get together and talk about fantasy, science fiction, and other nerdy things that we like to talk about. Today, look who's here.
It's me. I'm real.
We recently had somebody comment on one of our episodes. What have I done with my son? Is he like locked in the basement or something?
My response was, no, I'm locked in the cupboard under the stairs. But, it's the same thing.
It is a joy and privilege whenever I get to have fun with my son, when he has the time to come and be a part of these things. Honestly, you'd see him in more of the episodes if I wasn't so addicted to this hobby and just kept pumping out stuff when he's too busy to be part of it. He's not slighting you. He's just
I'd
got other
love
things to
to
do.
be doing more, but I do have other things that I need to attend to, unfortunately.
That's right. But today we're here in one of our shorter episodes. I think it'll fall into the quick take category, but it might go just a little bit long. We'll see. Where Zach is going to bring his take on an episode I brought to you previously that many of you responded, what would Zach think to this one? I talked about the fantasy classics, the books of the past that I found along the way that really hooked me on science fiction and fantasy. So I was really talking about fantasy for that episode. I don't know if Zach will dive into any science fiction, or if he just wants to stay in the fantasy realm too, it's up to him. But somewhere along the way, he also got sucked in, and that's why we can create Fantasy for the Ages. We've got stuff to talk about we like. Zach, tell us your journey. What were the books along the way that really impacted you to a degree that you wanted to keep reading in this genre?
So we have to start foundational and give credit not to me or anything that I read, but I do have to give credit to you. You are my father, and you quite literally read me some things. Not just me. There were some things that we read as a family. For example, one of the earliest things that was read to me as a book in general, honestly, probably about the same time Goodnight Moon was read to me, was Harry Potter. It became something that we read as a family. There are pictures of me as an infant in your arms while you also have a book.
You know I'm going to pull that out now and drop it in this episode.
I'm fine with it. It's fine. People have already seen all my baby pictures. People have probably also seen my awkward middle years pictures. It's fine. It's findable.
I've mostly tried to avoid those, but since
they're
you're
on your
mentioning
Facebook
them,
at the very least. Anyway, Harry Potter was one of the earliest, and for someone my age, that's not an uncommon story. We also talk about some other classics in this really early on. The Chronicles of Narnia were another fantasy book series that you read to us. And I had a fun little experience with this because we got these CD versions that were these dramatized editions. They were technically a little like abridged things because they weren't the exact readings. So they skipped out some of the prose and kept to more of the dialogue, but still told the stories in an interesting and produced fashion. And I enjoyed even listening to those on the Sony Discman that I carried around with me sometimes.
Nice.
And so it was just another way for me to just kind of enjoy early fantasy. As I was reading things that were a little bit more my level, there were a couple of standouts for me personally in the children's books or even the YA. And we hit some big names like Artemis Fowl. That is a classic, in my opinion, of children's fantasy. It's hidden world, but it deals with fae and fairies and funkiness, and it's just fun.
I read the first one after you had loved it so much.
Yeah.
I was too old, apparently. I really didn't get into Artemis Fowl much. I never read the others, but it wasn't bad.
It's a weird thing, though, that like a certain age group, I feel like it was great for. And if kids nowadays tried to read it, it wouldn't work. And I don't know why, but it just worked at the time. A couple other standouts. I do have to unfortunately admit, I was a Warriors Cat kid.
We have so many of these books still in our house, waiting for your children someday.
So many of them. These books about cats as the protagonists and these
Cats
clans
are cool.
and great adventures. And I love them, partially because this was one of the earliest for me personally, reading of large, expansive series with a lot of world building of something unique. Is it weird? Absolutely. I'm not denying that at all. It's also one of the first things that I ever wrote any fan fiction for, and that will never see the light of day. Ever. I was like
hashtag release
10.
the Zach version.
It was awful. Definitely never finished too, but I'll admit that I wrote it.
I remember something about the Warriors that's true to becoming a fan of the genre is you used to talk about these books with other friends.
I did.
Who also read the Warriors books.
At least a couple here and there.
Yep.
Not as many read them as much as I did, but I also remember like saving up quarters and walking to Barnes and Noble and buying multiple books with all my quarters. And I'm just real glad that as someone who has worked just like as an adult now, I'm sorry to anyone who ever had to count my quarters on books. Like, it's cute, but I'm sorry.
But it was mostly cute for those workers too. People who work in a Barnes and Noble love people who love books that much.
We jump to some other standouts of some of those early books that I read, and I need to highlight one, and you hate on this series way too much. Percy Jackson and the Olympians is a great early YA gateway into mythology and fantasy.
You're right.
And even other works of Riordan, the Kane Chronicles, fantastic. And just exposing to even more mythologies. And it gave me a first little like, hey, maybe I should look into some of these other mythologies, and then dove into the original old school actual mythology from way back in the day because of these things.
That made it into my episode like this, talking about the old Greek myths.
Nice.
Yep.
The last of the children's books that I'm going to mention before I get into other things is a series called Pendragon. And this gets interesting because it's not quite fantasy. Mm-hmm. It's not quite sci-fi either. It kind of rode that line right between them. It was one of my experiences of a single narrative form that was a 10-book series. This was a big series for me, but it was one continuous story with different stories in each one kind of thing. And it kind of started that gateway towards, okay, we've done some world building. We've done some interesting stories. What about epic things? What if we made this bigger? What if we raised the stakes a little bit? And it was still clearly, this is for kids, maybe a little bit older, middle school, but this is young. But it was also something a little bit more.
Okay.
It was also one of the earliest series that I gave to someone else. I liked it enough that I gave it to someone else to read at some point, shortly before we moved out of Alaska.
Sign of a true fan. Gifting those great books to someone else. Yeah.
Now, before I can talk more about books, I do have to jump over to other forms of media, because I know this is fantasy classics and things that shaped our getting into the genre. Mm-hmm. But I can't really talk about just books if I do that, because it's not the only thing that got me into sci-fi fantasy. I started at the beginning by saying you raised me on sci-fi fantasy. And that also partially goes into things we watched on TV. I was a Star Trek kid, and a Star Wars kid, and a Stargate kid. I was a Star Everything kid.
Battlestar Galactica kid.
That is also true. There were a lot of things that I just enjoyed getting to see these stories that way. And this form of media, movies, TV, is where I first really was introduced to The Lord of the Rings, Peter Jackson's classic adaptations. Mm-hmm. Fantastic.
Yeah.
I grew up on the extended edition so much that I didn't know what was in the theatrical and what wasn't. In fact, we saw Return of the King in theaters together, and I still didn't know what was in the extended and what was in the theatrical, because I remembered the extended from how much we watched it.
The extended is the only true version.
I loved these things. And so when I was in like third grade, I had kind of my first dalliance into what, as a kid, I thought of as adult fantasy. As an adult, I don't think of it as adult fantasy. But I did at the time, and I did it because of interest and because of spite. I read The Hobbit. And I did it because I loved the Lord of the Rings, the movies. I love this. This has got to be great. And because my sister couldn't get through the first couple of chapters. So I said, bet, I'll do it. And I did, and it became my favorite book for many years.
It's a lot to like in The Hobbit.
There have been other things that came up, other books, and there was always kind of an expansion on things I had already been reading, kind of aging things up. Shortly after finishing The Hobbit, I tried The Wheel of Time. I got through the prologue. I got through half the next chapter. And then between the book falling apart and not having a clue what was going on, I said, yeah, I can wait on that. That's fine.
I'm not ready.
We'll wait. And it took me a while to get back to what I now consider to be kind of adult fantasy. Eventually, I went back to it in high school, and I read the first 3 books of The Wheel of Time. And then I said, nah, I'm good for now. We can wait. That was a mistake. I can say that now, knowing that the next book that I would have read is my favorite of the series.
Yeah. Maybe it wouldn't be your favorite, though, if you'd read it too soon. If
Maybe.
you weren't ready for it yet.
It was a good chunk of time, late high school, early college, that I didn't really have a lot of time to be reading like I wanted to. And I think a lot of people can sympathize with that. Not everyone. Some people
Totally
need that escapism, but a lot of people get really caught up in studies or academic reading, and they just don't find the time to read. And that's okay. Everyone's journey is their own, and whatever it is okay. I was eventually glad to get back into some of these series, some of these things. I tried a couple of different books I knew you were talking about, I knew you had read, and I read little bits and pieces. I did read the entire Inheritance cycle on my own up until then, Christopher Paolini, and that kind of rid the line between YA to adult, and so I was kind of skirting around that. And finally, I said, "Okay, in college, let's give it a go." And I read through The Wheel of Time, and it was great. And I was finally like, I've pushed through, I've hit adult fantasy. And I said, okay, what's next? What more can I read? I feel good now. And this is where I almost made a really bad mistake.
Oh.
I almost just trusted you, which feels really mean to say. But
I know what you're going to say now.
I went and said, okay, I liked this. I read this. Hey, Dad, what are other books that you enjoyed? What are things I should read? And it wasn't the only thing on my radar, but I was like, yeah, he led me to The Wheel of Time. He'll lead me to other things I like. And he led me to Thomas Covenant, The Unbeliever. And I didn't like it.
Hey, at least I didn't lead you to The Sword of Truth.
To be fair, I'd experienced that one through a TV show adaptation previously.
Ooh, yeah.
Point being, I went down a direction of going, hey, this is a classic that you think is a classic. I don't like it. And I think there is a time and a place that my experiences as a younger reader, a newer reader to fantasy, sci-fi, means sometimes I find things that you loved when you were younger, and we've read now, and I don't really like them. There are a couple I'm going to throw out here that are going to be a little heretical. I don't like Dune that much.
It's not for everybody.
It's overrated.
Oh.
Don't get me wrong. It's good. It's overrated.
It's not overrated.
People die over, like, they will throw themselves in the line of heavy fire to protect Dune and its flaws.
People do the same thing with The Wheel of Time. And there's a ton of people say it's overrated.
Some people shouldn't. Some people should, because it depends on which ones you pick and choose. I won't defend every piece of The Wheel of Time. I'll say it's better than Dune.
Well, I don't argue that, but Dune is very different from The Wheel of Time.
Now, other contrast, I read Ender's Game. I liked it. I didn't really care that much for the rest of the series. I read the next book. I DNF'd the third.
That was okay.
And so there's bits and pieces here and there. We get fun things like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. That's very good. But we go, hey, let's read more of Douglas Adams. Dirk Gently? Not as good. I really had to figure out, okay, what do I pick and choose? What do I find? And there was a time, shortly after finishing The Wheel of Time, when you were steering me towards Thomas Covenant, that I maybe wouldn't have been as big of a fantasy reader as I am. And then I went, okay, I really liked The Wheel of Time. I really liked how it ended. Let's try more of Brandon Sanderson. And I, to this day, am still a very big Sander fan. He has his faults. People do have things against him or his writing, and people's criticisms are valid. But I, for one, do like his work. I love the Cosmere. I jumped from Wheel of Time then into Mistborn, and then was just like, okay, let's keep reading things. Let's keep reading Sanderson. Let's keep reading other things. Let's look at other content creators that are out there and what did they recommend. And I have since found a whole world of sci-fi and fantasy that I love, and occasionally things that I don't. Sometimes those things, more often those things, are the things that are a little bit older and sometimes don't feel like they have learned from the mistakes of the older stuff because they were making it for the first time.
Right.
And so it's its time and its place and it's valid. But anytime I read something older than, say, 1987, I have to keep in mind this was written before 1987. And then it's actually still pretty good. But I have to keep that in my head when I read it. That's more a fault of mine than the books, but it is where I am now as a sci-fi fantasy reader.
So you found your niche. You kind of know the lanes you enjoy, the types of things. You very recently now entered into Steven Eriksson's Malazan Book of the Fallen. Too early to know if it's your thing, or are you enjoying it enough that you think this will be good?
I think, and this is where it gets a little bit funky, I think I am going to enjoy Malazan Book of the Fallen. I don't think I'm going to love the world enough to read anything outside of the 10 core books. Other stories in this world, I don't know if will interest me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of other stories beyond the 10 core, but as you move further in, we'll see how you continue to feel about that. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for sharing your story. There's a little overlap in some of the ways you got into enjoying fantasy, but then we got to see your unique journey too. And like you said, everybody has their own journey. Hope you all enjoyed hearing about Zach's journey. That's where we're going to leave you today. Don't forget, if you enjoyed everything Zach had to say, whether you agreed with it or not, go hit that like button. It's somewhere down around, I don't know, somewhere down there.
Yeah,
go find it, hit it. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, we hope you will. Look down in the show notes, all the other ways that you can connect with Zach and I, our Discord server, social media, become a Patreon supporter. We really appreciate our patrons. And there's a comment box. Tell us your thoughts right here, and we always respond. Thanks for watching, everyone. We'll talk to you next time.